So welcome, Rabbi Posen. Nice to have you as our guest today.
I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Now, I know that you were just recently on an amazing mission to Israel, and I'd like to hear about that. But I first want to talk about October 7th itself, and to some extent, you and I work together. We are here at Congregation Neveh Shalom, and we have a lot in common. We share a lot of time together, and we're different people. So I wanted to ask you someone's saying that they're losing a connection, losing audio. Does anyone else keep losing audio before we continue okay, no, so that seems to, all right. So let's continue with our session. So I wanted to ask you, Rabbi Posen, after October 7th, what changed? What changed on October 7th for you individually and as a rabbi?
I think I didn't know what changed on October 7th. I now can look back on it and see that change. I remember waking up on October 7th in stunned disbelief. I woke up to a text from you, Cantor Bitton, that said, we have to talk. I can't believe it's happening in Israel. I hadn't seen the news yet because I go to bed well before you do. It was almost this in shock inability to really comprehend or understand the gravity of what had happened and how the world had seismically shifted in that moment. I think that for the longest time, it was easy to compartmentalize Israel as a place that is the land of Israel, as a Jewish place, as a Jewish homeland, and politically a place that is so fraught that there's only so much time I can give to fraught politics, both here in America and in Israel, that it was really tied into the political nature of what the religious right was doing in Israel, and not politically about the land itself or who was living there. It was something that I could say, that's a place where I don't feel comfortable as a Jew to express myself because of who I am. And after October 7th, that shifted, which I think you see happened in the country as well. All of those pro-democracy, everything has shifted now to who we are together. And so from October 7th moving forward, Israel is the forefront of my mind, whereas before it was sort of that in the back, a place that I talk about and connect to, but I'm not having in the front and center of my thoughts. It is now the hugest part of my identity again.
Isn't that incredible? You're saying, what you're saying is extremely profound. It's a complete shift, and yet I have no doubt that it was always important, and it's a question of this, not it was not even in the picture, and
right.
Yeah, it's what Israel means to us changed, right? I would say, so let me look at it differently. It sounds like you're saying before October 7th, you seem to have been a little bit more focused on the differences between
Correct.
what Israel was in the moment, and now you're looking at the similarities, the profound similarities that you have, or profound things that you have in common, not necessarily with the state, but with the people.
Yes.
Perhaps as another, yeah.
Well, and I think that on October, what happened on October 7th is the unity of Jewish people in the world, but in particular with our Jewish brothers and sisters that live in Israel, with those in Israel. That became the forefront of my mind, and the connection with the people and that land can't be taken for granted. And since then, with this rise in anti-Semitism, all the more so, Israel has become the center place also of Jewish identity, because we're seeing that the world can't separate them, and neither can I.
I love that. That's right. Yeah. That's right. It is independent of politics, isn't it? Now this is something fundamental that I believe that we as Jews in America have, as a people, as a community, have not succeeded in grasping until now, this idea of what a homeland is. I think it's been something cerebral, but as opposed to, and I always like to compare some, people have come from other lands and they come to America, and the difference between that experience and the Jewish experience. And it seems to me, right? And I remember taking a course on the history of Jewish immigration to the States or something like this in university. And I remember the professor, Professor Orenstein, saying something like, the immigrant from every other or any other country, particularly Europe, coming to the United States was looking for a better life. But if things didn't work out, there's a place that person could go back to. We didn't have that. For the Jew, this had to work. This was the escape route. And what I'm getting at is that other person had in their mind, oh, I come from Italy. I come from Ireland. This is my land. That's not the case here. So there's a shift let me ask you then.
Can I respond to that? I think about, where am I from? I always say Michigan is my home, although I'm creeping up on having been in Oregon about half as much time as I spent living in Michigan. But there was something about boarding the El Al flight. I sat down, and on the screen in front of you is Tfilat Haderech, the traveler's prayer. And just that simple, I have my notebook that I had with me on the plane in front of me. And the first thing I wrote down was, this is home. Because just that, the plane in and of itself, seeing that prayer that I say every time I travel, front and center in that place, this was also going home. I hadn't been in 17 years, and yet everything comes back as that familiarity of, yes, I just read about this in the Torah, and this is where it is home, in that sense that I don't think there's, even more so than going back to Michigan. My Michigan A challenge comes back out when I'm there. People sound like me. We call it pop, not soda, all of that, but it's not the same as being in this place where fundamentally it is my home.
Now, I want to jump to something. I was going to ask you is this something that you've noticed? I'll jump to the thing in a moment. This experience that you've had, have you ever seen that reflected in your congregants within the Jewish community?
Of Israel as a prime...
That shift, yes, and that shift of how we see ourselves in relation to Israel before October 7th and after October 7th.
Yeah, I think that because we can't live in a world where you talk about what happened on October 7th and not talk about Israel as a state, as a Jewish state. It's impossible. You can't separate those two anymore. And in the sense of even the political right, political left, every which way and center critique of Israel's government and politics, the shift of these are our people tells us that these are our people, and this is in ways that we haven't ever before felt drawn to names and people in Israel. It's almost like, it's not quite the same as Gilad Shalit, but I remember back when Gilad Shalit was taken hostage and there was this in America, right, prayers every day to bring him home, and the world sort of rallied, and that was just one person. And we've seen now this shift in the whole congregation. If we were to not mention it, if Israel, the prayer for Israel, more people are standing, more people want to be there because it's at the forefront of our identity as Jewish people.
Right. Now, what prompted this change? The October 7th, we talked about this. How do we teach this connection that we have, this profound unity that we have as Jewish people who may come from Morocco, who may come from Romania, who may come from Iraq, who may come from England, what have you? This profound connection that we have to each other and to our homeland. How do we do that out of love and positivity, as opposed to as a response to the great wave of anti-Semitism that we've encountered since October 7th? You see what I'm saying?
I think so. I think that as always, it's complicated,
Yeah.
right? In what that looks like. I think that one of the things that was so clear and was mentioned by numerous people when I was just in Israel is that the country is united. So
Yeah.
whereas there were days and weeks and weeks and weeks of protests against the government, and it was very heated, October 7th brought the people of Israel together. And these divisions don't matter. All that matters is walking forward in unity together. And the response from the people that we spoke with was, and we can't go back to. We're still angry with the government, but there's a full sense of that has to be secondary to our survival as a people. And what we need to do is to find a bridge to work together. And I think that in our world, what I bring back and what I think about how love of Israel doesn't go back to this divisive space, and it's still divided, right? I'm not going to live in this fairy tale world that all of a sudden we're all supporting in every way, shape, or form. But the context and nuance of Israel having to be front and center again in our minds and in our hearts as a state won't go back after October 7th. I think we can't allow it to. And I think that what we'll see is an understanding, as we've been forced to reckon with, is that we may not agree with the politics of every decision Israel makes. We do agree with Israel's right to exist.
Yeah. And we recognize that existential threat is very much alive and very real, and that it affects us whether we are in Tel Aviv or here.
Right.
Now, so you talked about your trip to Israel indirectly a moment ago. You alluded to it. You mentioned it briefly. Tell us about what this mission was. Who it was with, and a little bit about this, the goals of the mission.
Yes. So I'm going to do a full talk about this on December 20th. That's next Wednesday at 7 p.m. But we'll dig into some of this conversation now. So the trip was sponsored by the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. Mark Blattner, like so many federations and groups, wanted to bring people there to bear witness. So there were 9 of us from Portland, and we were joined because we were a small group. Mark had put it out to Jewish Federations of North America. Hey, does anyone else have a group that wants to go? Could we join together? And Jewish Nevada, so Las Vegas, we had 5 people from their federation join us as well. So we went together. The purpose of this trip was truly to bear witness, was to be present. So a lot of people have asked me, how long is the flight? So we flew directly from Los Angeles. So on the way there is about 14 hours, on the way home over 15 hours, and we were on the ground for like 56 hours. So all in all, I spent about equal time in the air as I did on the ground, and we were completely scheduled from when we woke up in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. So from 7:30 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night on all the days that we were there, the 2.5 days, we were meeting to bear witness, to listen to survivors. We did go down to one of the kibbutzim, to Kibbutz Nir Oz, to meet with those who've been evacuated, to meet with medical professionals, and then I call it the alphabet soup of Israel bureaucracy. So we met with some members of the IDF, a member of Knesset, and then also the Joint Distribution Committee and the Jewish Agency for Israel and United Hatzalah, the volunteer medics, to have this understanding of what's being done for the people, and also to hear firsthand families of hostages, people who tell their story from October 7th, so that it can be shared again and again, and the world can bear witness.
Okay. What did you learn from being there that you didn't that could only be accomplished by being there? You already knew the horrors of October 7th. You already knew that there was a wave of anti-Semitism after that. You already knew that Jews of Israel were being united because of the threat. So what was being on the ground? How did being on the ground differ from your from where, what was different about being there?
I mean, so first has to do with my learning style and the way that I find myself as an activist. I'm my best activist self when I have firsthand experience. So I compare, it's not the same, but when I went to Guatemala in 2019 and was able to hear stories and meet the people and have that tactile experience, it changed the way that I was able to ask questions and connect. And so being in Israel and standing at Kibbutz Nir Oz and meeting with people puts a human face that you're not getting through the filters of American news media. So I don't speak Hebrew. I understand Hebrew. I'm a nervous Hebrew speaker. So, I can watch Israeli news and get it from that perspective, but so much of what my understanding of October 7th and after has to be filtered through what's true and what's not, and what are people sharing and what are they not showing you. So everything has a bias. And while I do have my own personal bias, being there firsthand allowed me to hear even the things that get censored from a newscast or things that would not necessarily be shared up front in that way. It gave me that a different connection. I'd also say, as somebody who'd been to Israel before, you can't understand the shift in the feeling of an entire country unless I felt it.
Yeah.
You feel that shift. So I say that the national sound of Israel is the car horn honking, and there was no honking. Nobody was honking. It was quiet, which is just shocking to think about.
Yeah. And you mentioned what you're saying is so true in that communication is not just verbal or written. We say, by being in the room and talking to each other, there's a lot more that's said in the way we talk, in the eyes, in the tone, that I would imagine this is what you're talking about, how you picked up on the emotional side of that impact by being there. And look, when I was younger, I volunteered on Kibbutz Alumim for a summer. I was 18, and I remember being able to see the outskirts of Gaza from our kibbutz, from certain parts of it, and seeing just knowing that there's a personal connection that changes. And I wasn't there the way you were on a mission, but that idea that, oh, I know what that looks like over there, and seeing some horrific images of a person being killed just at the gates of this kibbutz. Just, my gosh, I know what that place is, and this was somebody I knew at the time. That reality that hits home. It hits home when it's, you said, tactile, when it's tangible, right? Mm-hmm. When it's real. Now, you mentioned a word earlier about that you encountered people who had been through the horrors of October 7th, and you called them survivors. Can you talk about the link between that and the Holocaust? I think that I would imagine that is linked in your language, and not just your language, but I suspect that there is a connection that is made with the Holocaust. Can you address that?
So I think that there's also, I'm going to start with the distinction between, we met with people who survived October 7th. Those are the people that were in the kibbutzim or the surrounding areas that were hit by rockets in that way. So not all of Israel would identify themselves as survivors.
Right.
And then there are the evacuees, who some of them are also survivors. Some of them were not affected, but because of the ongoing military operations, they've been moved 4 kilometers from Gaza, and anyone within 7 kilometers of the north has all been moved because of the missiles that are being shot, the rockets that are being shot. So there is a distinction that Israel is making. But when we use the word survivor, these are growing up listening to stories of Holocaust survivors who can tell you how they were moved from their homes into the ghettos or the work camps and the trains and all of that. And they tell you this story from, it was in 1939 when X happened, and then Y, and then Z, and that is what the survivors of Nir Oz and the surrounding areas, the surrounding kibbutzim, tell you. They're telling you it's not over years like you would have for the Holocaust, but they'll tell you it started at 6:10 in the morning. On October 7th, it was 6:10 in the morning, and we heard the sirens going off and got in our safe rooms. And then they'll give you a timeline, largely using their WhatsApps. So it's a total, this is what I texted here, and here's what happened here, and here's where we are. And they'll tell you the horrors that they've seen, just like a Holocaust survivor would tell you what they saw happen in front of their own eyes. You'll hear from these survivors the stories of death surrounding them. And that was true in every survivor that we heard from, were stories of having to run undercover, having death, especially at Nir Oz and Be'eri, Kfar Aza, and I mean, even Nova survivors. We didn't speak with someone who was at Nova, but the stories are the same of survival, of hiding and trying to dodge bullets while death has completely surrounded you. And the horror and the fear of not knowing where it's coming from and who's there. It was very similar to when you hear from survivors of Nazi Germany. The other pieces, you go to the Holocaust museums and you see shoes or glasses, things that have been taken. And from the Nova Festival, we were there, we saw the pictures, but from Nova, they had the keys of everyone who had to flee and left their things there. You see the backpacks and the keys. It is eerily similar to the piles of things that were left behind in Nazi Germany.
And for those who don't know, Nova is the music festival that occurred just outside of Kibbutz Re'im. Amazing account, Rabbi Posen. The other, I think one thing to underline about the link, the Holocaust, beyond the personal experience and how they perceived it, and these images, is the intention of Hamas terrorists to kill, to torture.
A complete massacre.
Jews,
it's
right?
A massacre.
And regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of political affiliation, or what have you. And this is why it seems to me, right? This is why so many people have used that phrase, never again is now. We made this vow after 45, that never again will this happen. And I've heard some, Israeli politicians talk about how they feel they failed. And do you feel that the reality, set aside blame about the politicians and Israel's defense, this idea of never again, this resonates with all Jews outside of Israel, around the world. Do you feel that that's what's being tapped into your community here in Portland and others that you are talking to in North America, that's what we just witnessed, this intention that's an echo of the Holocaust?
I think the answer is sadly yes. And I started in the beginning with Israel was sort of never, it wasn't out here, but we said, the balance of up or down and being in the forefront of our minds. It's easy in a time when you feel safe to not think about that. And what I hear, especially from Israelis who asked me if I felt safe in America, not the other way around. They told me where their safety comes from now and where they are in Israel, but they're worried about Jews around the world and whether or not we're safe. To have that being asked is very clear that never again is now, and that this is the space to be thinking about what it means to identify as a Jew and how the world sees Jews as inextricably linked to Israel. And these actions are anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic in the same breath.
So let me move a bit more to your position as a rabbi. I know everything you're talking about has that. You are that, but in terms of your congregation, in terms of your role as a rabbi, do you feel, we say thoughts and prayers is what happens a lot in after certain tragedies in America. But this is sort of what we do in a congregation. We have thoughts, we have prayers. It's a house of prayer. Is that enough at a time like this? our prayers. What is the role of the synagogue, and what is your role as a rabbi to your congregation at a time like this?
This is a question that I struggle with, and you know that I struggle with this, because I do come from a place where, generally speaking, I don't think politics necessarily belong on the bima. That prayer is a place of uniting us as a Jewish people, and that it shouldn't be a place that makes you feel othered. And I often will speak in nuance about Jewish values that tell you where my political stance may be, but never in the intent. It's a Jewish valued nuanced space, not calling out one specific place. After October 7th, I also had a policy before of not really talking about Israel publicly, because it's so complicated in my own head. And I didn't feel educated enough that I could be a voice in the same way that you could, Cantor, because of our, we have different things that we have our expertise in. Since October 7th, I can't not talk about Israel. And whether or not it's the politic of it is the war, but I'm not talking about the war from the bima. I'm talking about human life from the bima, and massacres that are happening, and hatred. And to have a Shabbat where we, don't say the prayer for the hostages, even that must be a part of what we do. And yes, it's thoughts, and yes, it's prayers, but those prayers, there's not very little that we can do, but there's very little that we can feel like we're doing in the world right now. We can speak up, we can post. Not everyone can go to Israel right now. Not everyone can, go hug a survivor and listen to their story firsthand and help them in that healing process. But I have a voice that I can speak to the power of what's happening in the world and the importance of speaking up that goes beyond thoughts and prayers. And I do speak from the bima about it.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to I meant to interject, but I didn't know. I wasn't sure if you were finished with your thought. And it seems to me that by having that shift from the pulpit that you mentioned, you are sending a signal to your congregation, which is a positive one, I think. And it is not, let's discuss the judicial reform issues. It's not, let's discuss which politician is better for, I don't know, women's interests. What politician is better for the two-state solution discussion. It's nothing to do with that. Right. It has to do with identity. I think that's this idea that you keep talking about, how that that foundational role that Israel occupies in the mind of the Jew, right? That I think is being conveyed beyond thoughts and prayers. But go ahead.
Especially, and because we read the Torah every week. And so this is not just the modern state of Israel. We're talking about a land that is our story. To have been reading Lech Lecha, go to this land, and to see these places. And I teach every week. We're reading our way through prophets right now. So to have just read about Jericho and the temple being built, and to stand, that is our historical homeland. That's not political. That is, if you, as a Jew, the Torah is my narrative. The Torah is my foundational document of my identity, and this land is inextricably tied to that.
Oh, beautifully said, Rabbi. Now, a bit of politics without getting into politics. We post October 7th, we've seen this wave of anti-Semitism. There's a shift that you addressed a moment, throughout our conversation. But what about allies of the Jewish community, right? Where I know that I have had many conversations with friends, with family, about disappointments that we've had, eye-opening moments perhaps, about friends that are outside the Jewish community, institutions, movements, certain social and perhaps political movements. Have you had that kind of experience as well post October 7th, of these sort of reevaluations regarding, or disappointments in in circles that you used to say, hey, that's my circle?
I think that questions of allyship are fully at the forefront of our minds. So I want to mention that Pastor Matt Hennessy of Vancouver Baptist was on the trip with me. He came as a friend of the Jewish community here in Portland. He had studied in Israel. He lived in Beersheba. It is a fundamental part of his understanding of religion. And for him to come with in this time, I spoke volumes about his support of his, I mean, he calls us his brothers and sisters in that space, and that it was profound for him. So they ask you when you go through customs, right, why are you here? And they were asking all of the Jews why we were here. And, you know, he said, I'm a pastor. And the question, why? And the power of his answer, because I have to be here, because it matters. My voice can support my friends, was incredibly powerful, knowing that in other places, friends who we've stood up and with for other issues on you know, not just like gun control, but also LGBTQ, and in all of these other spaces, it's very easy to create a narrative of supporting the minority against the majority. And in this case, Jews who are a world minority are seen as a majority. And the loss of support from people who we've stood by their sides when they were in the minority position has been astounding. It's like, who's the smallest, who has the least amount of rights, which I think is an unfair dichotomy, and it does nothing to further the conversation about what's happening in our globally, not just Israel and Gaza, but globally, what's happening in our world and the way that we see human beings has shifted in terms of what allyship looks like, in terms of villainization of without fact has really changed. And I do feel it took some of my pastor friends a long time to reach out and ask me how I was after October 7th. And they're still not quite at that level, because it's not, you can't, I think they don't understand the level of connection.
So that's amazing, because is it, I was about to ask you why, and you just sort of addressed it. And there was a question, I was going to deal with the questions a little later on, but there's a question here in the chat. Do you think that non-Jewish people understand that Jewish identity is intrinsically tied to the land of Israel?
I think that they don't. And I think that and I want to be careful here, because my identity is tied to the land of Israel, not necessarily the government of the modern state of Israel. And I do feel like I have this conversation often, especially with people who are converting to Judaism, about the modern state of Israel. I don't know anyone who believes with absolutely every decision made in that country, just like I don't believe with every decision made in America. But the fact that the land of Israel is the land of our history, that they found just the other day iron swords that were from, you know, that we're celebrating Hanukkah, and they're finding oil jugs, right, in the temple area, right, in the excavations. I think it's very hard for people whose foundational text, because it gets whitewashed away from the Bible, as we call it, and moves towards New Testament. It doesn't hold the same kind of connection to the entirety of the land, or the fact that that is the place as such a minority that we have. That's the only place that our history started. Whereas if you look at other, you know, especially in Christianity, it spread so quickly through different means, but there are magnificent churches and that are much older than synagogues are anywhere else in the world other than in Israel, because they were able to live there.
Now you mentioned
can I make one more comment on
Please,
that?
go ahead.
Which is, you know, Christmas is coming up, but Christmas is tied to a person, not necessarily the land in which that person was born. Whereas our Jewish holiday and calendars are inextricably connected to the land of Israel. The Jewish calendar is the land of Israel calendar in terms of the agricultural calendar. Our 3 pilgrimage festivals are directly tied to Jerusalem. They're not about the person who was there. They are about the experience of community there. And I don't think that others can understand that because it's not a cycle they live in.
So do you think that's why they don't, or because we are not doing a good enough job of messaging? This is who we are. Hello.
Yes and yes. I mean, I think that it's you, and like I said, like I went to Israel because I do my best work when I can identify, when it's tactile, when I'm feeling it. And you can't understand what it is to be tied to somewhere you've never been.
Yeah.
Unless you've had that kind of an experience. And I think in it now, it is more important than ever for us to speak up about that connection, especially language that's being used politically about colonialism and what that looks like. Like, how do you explain the story of Hanukkah? And somebody says, okay, but Jews colonized Israel, when like that language makes it harder. We haven't done a good enough job, I think, as Jews of explaining that fundamental history, that you call it the Old Testament and the New Testament. You have to recognize old comes before new.
Right. Very well said. And you just touched on two things in the same short paragraph, which is that spiritual, faith-based connection, but also tangible, historical, archaeological connection. You mentioned the swords that were found from, was it the Bar Kokhba,
I think it was,
bolt or something like that? I mean, incredible. You dig, you find Jewish history. And it's one thing that regarding politics, regarding identity, perhaps less so politics, but I feel that we've been so stuck in politics in America. There's this division, this extremes that we're seeing around the world. It's not just in the States, it's not just in Israel, it's affecting everybody. And I think as a result of that, we're afraid to say certain things. We've been afraid to go, well, this is part of my group, I have to stay in this little. In terms of messaging, I think that when people have stood up and said, hey, I'm pro-Israel. I don't like that terminology, but let's just use that for a moment. I'm pro-Israel. There's been a tendency for people, rightly or wrongly, to go, oh, then you're a right-wing person, right? And I think for years I've been saying, I believe that the progressive left in America needs to stand up when they see that the criticisms of Israel cross the line to fundamental existential questioning. Hey, I don't know if it crosses over into, I don't think, to demonization, or I don't think Israel has a right to exist, whether that's said directly or indirectly. It seems to me that anybody who feels that the Jewish state must continue to exist needs to stand up and go, hey, especially, I'll talk about progressives. I am a progressive, let's say, and say, I believe, I want a place at your table. I am a Jew who has a homeland. That's where the line has been crossed. Do you feel that sort of, that sense of political identity in America has prevented Jews from speaking up in that sort of clear way to say, I agree with this, and this, and that's a line I don't feel comfortable? Or do you feel that has been spoken? They haven't spoken and have paid the price.
I mean, I think that I'm a big believer in gray areas, and the world lives in binary black and white. Mm-hmm. And I think that we do a disservice in every part of our lives when we don't think of blending, in the sense of it's not all one and it's not all the other, that there are places and times, and in particular, Israel-Palestine conversation, Israel-Hamas, in this conversation, binary thinking has gotten us to where we are in this. If you're Republican, you're pro-Israel. If you're Democrat, that's not true. And we've held that for the longest time. And our American world has not actually done us any favors in our political system in trying to build in that nuance. But I think what we're seeing now, especially in the college student age and a little bit beyond, in the 20s, and people in their early and mid 20s who have a homeland in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, and are devastated by the military force and response in Gaza. And it's we live in a place where if you critique Israel right now, then you're anti-Israel, which doesn't make sense. But because the world doesn't understand the nuance and we don't allow for that space and conversation, we're living in a media where you're either a thumbs up or a thumbs down world.
Right.
We're not engaging. There's no room for that. And I think that it's important to be able to say, like, I am a proud American, and I don't love a lot of the policies that are being put into place in this country. And here, I don't get made into somebody who doesn't value human life when I say that. But when you stand up and you say, in this particular instance, the world says, if you support Israel, then you don't value human life. That's the narrative that's being shared. And I think as Jews, we owe it to ourselves and to stand up and say, that's not correct. That this is so much more complex than big bad Israel fighting tiny little Hamas. In fact, Libby Weiss, who grew up in Portland and is an IDF spokesperson in Miluim in her reserves duty, she said, when we do this, we take away the autonomy of Hamas. Everybody's forgetting that Hamas is an actual entity with autonomy and an elected government. So what we're doing is we've created this narrative where Israel is a political entity and Hamas is almost a moral entity, which is, I mean, how could I ever, right? I don't believe that, but that's what's getting portrayed, as opposed to holding accountable who needs to be held accountable in every space. Two wrongs don't make a right, people. And two rights don't make a right.
There's a question here by that I'd like to address to read by Raisa. My biggest worry, anger, and every other negative emotion is how the world, media, Ivy League colleges, social media, friends, it's a lot of people, a lot of groups there, reacted or didn't react to the worst massacre of the century on Jews on October 7th. Where is the outcry for the an 8-month-old hostage? How can we bring those voices out of silence and bring it to the outrage that I feel daily? What can we do to facilitate that? I don't know if you want to address that.
I mean, it's interesting. This was a conversation that we had, I've had again and again, not just in Israel, but since I've been back. It took until October 9th. People cared about what happened in Israel until October 9th, maybe the 10th.
Wow.
And then when Israel started to, their military offensive and defensive moves, within a split second, it was all about the numbers coming out of civilians in Gaza. It happened that quickly. And yes, there was both sighting happening, all of that happened. And what's haunting is in Israel, everybody tells you that Israel is still on October 8th. That in parts of Israel, the world stopped on October 7th. So in Kibbutz Nir Oz, I saw, Raisa, you mentioned the 8-month-old who's now 10-month-old, the Bibas family, and they lived at Nir Oz. So I was in their backyard. It looked just like my backyard. Aside from the melted plastic of the play structure, that's the little car, the little tyke, the red and yellow car. They had that, like I have in mine. The world seems to have moved on because of politic and not human life, because human lives are being seen in this different light, that they feel they have to speak up for the little guy, which is Hamas, which we as Jews understand fundamentally that that's not actually true, and that the media people aren't being held accountable. And I think that what this comes back to truly is the accountability factor. And it's easy to hold a government that's well organized accountable and less easy to hold terrorists accountable, sadly, for their actions, because there's not a mechanism to shut them down unless it's war, and then civilians die. And we're in this sort of catch-22 cycle in the world. I do think that one of the questions that I've been saying over and over since, is why is the world calling for a ceasefire, but no one is calling for the return of the hostages? Why does nobody know that if Hamas were to just return all the hostages, Israel would stop? It's true. The Israeli military has said this. Nobody is calling. This is when you take away Hamas's agency. They are actual people who have a choice to make here. Their choice to hold these people hostage, continue to hold them, is because they're getting great publicity of Israel coming in this war. And until we can actually speak up about that, and that's the hardest part. Yes, people don't think they're supporting Hamas. They think they're supporting innocent civilians. And that is just so hard to even wrap your head around, because the line is so blurry. Whereas it's okay to be, not every Israeli supports the government of Israel. They have spoken up and had rallies about this. When it comes to Hamas and Gaza, if you have a rally, you're dead. So there is no one speaking up against them. And so people don't realize the difference between that they don't realize that Hamas is not the innocent people of Gaza, because they're a government.
Now, the other thing is that you've addressed this a little bit before, regarding, you mentioned minority and majority and how we're perceived. There's been decades of influence, if you want to use a word. Brainwashing is another word, but there's been decades of our society seeing the Palestinian, forget Hamas, the Palestinian as the oppressed, and defining Israel as the oppressor. Forget what the reality is. Forget nuance. Very black and white, methodical positioning in the imagination of North American and the world, as the mind of the non-Jewish average person, certainly in universities. This is the category. And to go into the details of this war and the details of the conflict, a lot of that is lost, because you're not. So someone mentions, can we address, can Israel approach PR the way that Hamas does? I mean, I can let you answer this, but my answer to that is, it is a hard battle, because it is not today or tomorrow, or even a week or a month that will effect change, because we're battling decades of positioning this narrative in that way. And I think that's what we saw in October. You mentioned October 9th. I think that's what was triggered. It's like, oh, we're back to our narrative.
I think that the other piece of that, and Israel is terrible at the PR machine, and they know that, and that it's decades and decades of it not being dealt with in that way. I think that the bigger piece of it is that we also are living in a time where we're calling out colonialism, we're calling out the wrongs of the past in such a clear way, and talking about reparations and all these other things, that it's very easy to use that lens and transfer it into other places. And that is what we're used to doing. Oh, I identify with this. I can understand it in this way. So I'm going to take this framework and I'm going to put it over here. And then it paints this like very clear picture, except that it's not a clear picture. It only looks it because in your brain, you've made it fit the mold, as opposed to going back and having historical clarity on what's happening. So the people, I think that this, in the PR especially, and in this time of social media and the 24-hour news cycle, that if we could go back to October 7th, I mean, if we could go back, we wouldn't have it happen, right? We can't do that. But if you could go back, and if every newscast began with a history lesson of how many times were the Palestinian and Arab people offered a state of their own? How did Israel end up with Gaza? Well, I do believe there was a war that happened, and they won, right? This history has not been shared. I know the history. I'm saying shakes of heads. We learn, as Jews, we learn that history. We may learn it in a whitewashed way sometimes, but we do learn about that complete back history, right? That background is not known. And so when you see the modern state of Israel that's been around and is thriving, and you don't understand all the work and struggle that got there, it's impossible to then come up and share why Israel's army is so strong. Right. And people call it propaganda when we bring it up. People don't understand. They just don't understand. And so one of the things, and Honest Reporting, so Honest Reporting, if you don't follow them, you really should. Their founder, Gil Hoffman, he spoke to us in Israel, and they are not anti-Israel and not pro-Israel, although they are pro-Israel in the sense of pro-truth, and getting out what the misconceptions in media are and how stories are being told. They have done the work to have so many reporters fired because they simply, they go and they background check them. And he said, the New York Times says to me, you background check them better than we did. Like, that's the problem. It's not even Israel's own PR. It's that we only see what we want to see. And we need to rely on Times of Israel and Honest Reporting, which are giving as much as they want to be, non-biased opinions of real life facts of what's happening on the ground and sharing that out. Those voices are heard far and few between, but nobody is calling out. How did the New York Times, the AP, and Reuters, how did they have pictures so quickly of what Hamas did in Israel on October 7th? Nobody stopped to ask, because those reporters were in Gaza, saw something happening, went with them, and now made millions of dollars selling those photos because it was about what I saw as opposed to the valuing of human life. And, it was, I was just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
Well, really. And also on that front, this is not a democratic region, and you don't get work without the approval of Hamas. And you're not going to print things that Hamas disapproves of. So there's other things at play. That there are two or perhaps three more that I want to address, and I'm not going to go in order. But because you just talked about this now, Brenda speaks about some points that she has found. She mentions AIPAC, but basically there's so many resources right now that we're finding on social media that outline some truths or that combat some of the perceptions that are out there. And she asks, I've been tempted to forward those to friends and neighbors who have been sympathetic to us and are interested. Do I have a responsibility to do this? That, in other words, to clarify certain issues regarding media and what have you.
I think I was asked this question by our U.S. wires when I was at the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism conference. Was that 2 weeks ago? It was right before I flew from Baltimore back to go to Israel. Long story, long flight. But they asked me the same question. What is their responsibility in forwarding and getting this information out? And it was a panel of 4 rabbis. And I think we all landed in the space of, if you have the strength and you have the ability and mental capacity and, emotional capacity to send it, yes. And our responsibility is also to take care of ourselves. And it is an exhausting time to be a human. It is an even more exhausting time to be a Jew. And we have a responsibility to speak up when we can, but we also need to preserve ourselves. This is, it's not a sprint. This is a marathon. And so sharing information, yes, often we're sharing into our own echo chambers, which is the other part of this. And I think that making sure corrected information is there is fundamental and essential, but not over your mental health. And I think I've been trying to speak more clearly about this from the Bima as well, which is that if we're all exhausted, we won't have the voice to keep speaking up. That's when apathy comes. You see that, and we see that in history again and again. And so I also just want to be very clear that in Israel, one of the things that I saw that was so profound was within the first 72 hours of October 7th, every survivor was met with a trauma team and a psychologist for ongoing mental health care. All of the evacuees have been met for mental health care. In Israel, this is what they're doing. We need to also remember for ourselves here that we have been through a collective trauma in a different way, and that we need to care for our own mental health, because I have real concerns about what that's going to do to us moving forward if we don't.
Excellent answer. Thank you, Rabbi. I also want to echo what you've just said and talk about it's that balance. And at the same time, we are in this crisis mode and are dealing with assaults of various kinds, various levels. And I do think going for it, in other words, confronting it as much as possible, is a good thing. It's certainly reinforcing those friendships. But when it's someone who's being friendly towards us as Jews and wants to know more or is open to it, yes, go for it. And to that point where you say, Rabbi, where what's good for your mental health, because overdoing it is overdoing it, and this is emotionally taxing. There's one thing I want to. There's an earlier message, and I think that'll be the last one before I wrap up. Marnie wrote regarding something that we talked about earlier. How do you think Jews in America who feel politically homeless should be moving forward post October 7th?
I mean, it's really hard because we're also set up in a system of black and white, of Democrat, Republican, and what control can look like, and what political leadership in the United States looks like. And we are in a very fraught, again, election cycle, not only with our international politics and policies, but also with domestic issues. And groups that we may have supported because in the past have let us down as Jews in this time. And so it does feel very isolating. It's not like we have a coalition government where you can get a little bit of X, a little bit of Y, and a little bit of Z, and somehow they make it work. We have very clear lines that are being drawn. I think that the worst thing that we can do is promote further difference and division in our own country. And we can, instead of saying, I can't believe you voted, there's the presidential election, but there's also our elected representatives and senators and state level and national level. And what we have to do is educate ourselves. We have to educate ourselves on what is both what we need here domestically and how that plays out in the larger picture. It used to be very easy, vote Democrat all the way down. My politics, my social, whatever, it's going to be taken care of. La-di-da. That's not true anymore. And that means that we have a job to be, just like we can't lay back and let what's happening in Israel happen in America too. We have to wake up and actually do our own investigative work on what these policies are, where people stand, and ask the questions with town halls, etc. Really, truly what the stance is, to have an understanding of where we want to stand. And that may be voting in a way that you never thought you would before, but because it sits where you are, and you're not alone. All of us are homeless at this point.
Excellent answer, Rabbi. I keep saying October 7th has shown us that we need to reevaluate everything. It doesn't mean you change everything, but you need to discuss it and be open. And it is hard. It is hard to do that because we like staying in our lanes and just going that way. And I believe in this. It's not a word you use, but I think you're saying this as well. Advocating for ourselves, advocating for yourself in terms of your health, your mental health, in terms of who your friends are that can support you, in terms of your friends are as an individual, but also as a community. And that's kind of what you're saying. It's like, look out for our interests. For we're a people that likes tikkun olam, that likes to see the betterment of the world and all that. But you can't better the world if you're broken. And we have to kind of sustain ourselves and speak up for ourselves. And I think that's what I was getting at before when I said, if you're on the progressive left, fight for your place at that table, right? And do ask those questions. And we're lucky, as hard as things are right now in the States. Now, I'm not an American citizen, but we are lucky to live here in the United States and in the West, where we have a voice, where we do have friends in high places, in government. Not every single person, but there are people, and it behooves us to use our voices and speak up. Rabbi, I want to thank you so much for being my guest today on Proudly Jewish. This has been a fantastic conversation. I wish I could have gone on that mission to Israel with you. And it sounds like you were truly enriched, although I know it was very difficult. I think, again, on behalf of everyone that's here, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your experiences and your insight.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.